Yes, it's marvelous.
I turn it over to you and Nils to...
Yes. Was it John Wingard or John Wyckoff who wrote for the Green Bay Press Gazette? You know?
Greetings. I hope everybody can find a seat. I know we've been blessed with wonderful attendance here, and if anybody's got an empty seat next to them or anything like that, if you could raise your hand, because I've got a couple people standing. A couple of seats down here, sir, if you want. Well, welcome, everybody. I am Ken Davis, the Dean of the Law School, and it's my great pleasure as Dean to welcome all of you to the 14th in our series of Thomas E. Fairchild Lectures. The Fairchild Lectures, as many of you know, are always a high point of the academic year here at the law school, and give us an opportunity to simultaneously honor Judge Fairchild and listen to distinguished speakers as they discuss topics of particular interest to the legal profession. This year is unique for two reasons. First of all, we are blessed with the opportunity to have not one but two Fairchild Lectures in this academic year. Many of you were with us in the fall when we had maybe she'll be a judge someday, Professor Elizabeth Warren from Harvard talk to us about bankruptcy topics. But this spring we're doing something a little bit out of the usual and having a panel presentation, which I don't think we've ever had before. Have we, Judge Fairchild? And what is particularly unique about this Thomas Fairchild Lecture is that we're putting the judge himself to work as one of the panelists. So usually he gets to sit there and beam, but today he's going to have to work for it. We have a number of outstanding individuals to hear from today. I'm going to turn the podium over right now to two of Judge Fairchild's former law clerks who are responsible for putting together this program, Attorney Matt Flynn of Quarles & Brady and Professor Nils Olson, the Dean of the University of Buffalo Law School, who will introduce the panel to us. Gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Dean. I just wanted to say at the outset, I'm Matt Flynn of the two. I'm not the academic. My friend Nils Olson is at the other end of the table. There's so many distinguished people in this audience. I'd like to recognize everyone, but I can't, obviously. There are two people I'd be remiss in not recognizing. I want to do so now. And the first one is a person who also was instrumental in building the Democratic Party in the 50s, who happens not to be at the podium, but had an equal part in it, and that's Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild. Mrs. Fairchild. And the other person, there was another panelist who would have joined us had this occurred last year and passed away, and that is Judge and Governor John Reynolds. But today we do have Mrs. Jane Reynolds, and I wanted to recognize her as well. Thank you for joining us. And incidentally, apropos of that, there are many of us here who very much hope that the new federal building that's going to be built up in Green Bay will be named the John Reynolds Federal Building, and I just hope that very much, and I think all of us do. I'd also be remiss in not noting that another stalwart of the Democratic Party, Congressman Henry Royce, cannot be with us today because he passed away, and we remember him as well very fondly. At this juncture, before I recognize our panel, I just want to hand this microphone briefly to Nils Olson, my friend and colleague. I was a clerk of Tom Fairchild's in the mid-'70s. Nils was a year ahead of me. Nils is an academic and is at the Dean of the Buffalo Law School. It's his idea that we had this. And can you explain why we're having this and not a scholarly person doing something?
We have many scholarly people here. I clerked for Judge Fairchild during 1974 and 75, and this was a particularly auspicious time and a fortunate time for me because the judge was in the process of succeeding Luther Swigert as Chief Judge of the Seventh Circuit, and as a result, he was moving from his longtime home in Milwaukee at the same time that I was moving to Chicago. Mrs. Fairchild was in Milwaukee for the beginning months of my clerkship, trying to supervise this enormous move. So the judge was living temporarily in a residence hotel on the near north side, where he was, without a doubt, the most prominent tenant in the building. I also lived on the near north side, and my wife was in Europe working on her PhD, so for several months I had the great opportunity of sort of being a de facto bachelor with the judge. And we would frequently work late, enjoy the libations and German cuisine at Berghoff's, and then walk up State Street back towards our homes as they were. During these times and throughout the clerkship, and beyond, I came to appreciate the richness and historical and personal significance of the judge's extensive and foundational political career prior to his taking a seat on first the Wisconsin Supreme Court and then the Seventh Circuit. I learned the significance of this through many wonderful stories of his experiences campaigning with Eleanor throughout the state, on his own behalf for Attorney General, and probably most interestingly for me, for U.S. Senator against Joe McCarthy in the Tail Gunner Joe campaign, and on behalf of many others. These stories were frequently about his wonderful friends and associates, his political allies, Jim and Ruth Doyle, Horace Wilkie, John Reynolds, Gaylord Nelson, and many others, including his friend from Illinois, Bill Proxmire. It was very apparent how much the judge had enjoyed and contributed during his political experiences. So when I was afforded an opportunity to help plan a Fairchild Lecture, the idea of bringing together a number of the judge's friends to meet together and discuss their recollections was irresistible. Not knowing exactly what to do next, I immediately contacted my friend Matt Flynn, who of course did. Matt, who clerked immediately following me, was also very impressed and interested in all of the judge's experiences. He was so interested, in fact, that he started a political career of his own. Well, several of the law clerks that have had the privilege of working with the judge have honored his judicial career through their appointments as federal district judges and magistrate judges. Matt honored his political experiences by undertaking an active political role, serving as chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party and running twice for Congress. I think I was probably the only person in New York who gave him financial support when he ran. Not enough, though, I guess. Matt leapt to the project with his usual enthusiasm and effectiveness and quickly secured the participation of today's distinguished speakers, working with the law school to make this event a reality. I'm very pleased and excited to have been a small part of this process and look forward with pleasure to the forum. My only regret, as with Matt, is that Jim Doyle, Ruth Doyle, Judge Reynolds couldn't be here today to participate as well. I think at our very first Fairchild Lecture at dinner, Judge Reynolds was the dinner speaker, and he had absolutely incredible speaker with wonderful recollections of these times. I'm glad to see everybody here, and I'll give it back to Matt now to introduce our distinguished panel.
Thank you very much, Nils. The first person I'd like to introduce, and I think for those of you, many of you know this, but if those of you don't, before 1949, if there was a Democratic Party in Wisconsin, it traveled by night and lived off the land. It was not a well-organized Democratic Party. This is the generation that founded the Democratic Party, and the first speaker that I'm going to introduce is Governor and Ambassador Patrick Lucey. The governor he was elected to 2 terms as governor, served as lieutenant governor, chair of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin at a time when it was very difficult to be the chair, and he did a lot of the organizing, served in the state assembly. Really one of the founding members of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. It's with a great deal of pleasure I turn the microphone over to Governor Pat Lucey.
Thank you very much, Matt. I'm certainly honored to be participating in this event. I looked over the lectures you've had for the last 13 events, and I must be the first non-lawyer to address this audience. I'm particularly delighted to share this assignment with my good friends Gaylord Nelson and Ellen Proxmire, as well as with Professor Shasko. I've been asked to talk about the revitalization of the Democratic Party in the middle of the 20th century. And so I would begin by talking about the primary that occurred in the Republican Party in 1946, where Senator Robert La Follette, attempted to get back into the Republican Party after they had had a separate progressive party for 12 years and came up against the obstacle of Joe McCarthy. And with the loss of that primary campaign by Bob La Follette, it became pretty clear that a new political alignment was necessary in Wisconsin. And many politicians, and many voters for that matter, interested voters, had to make a very tough choice. Since they were no longer a progressive party to belong to, would they become Republicans? Would they become Democrats in 1948 and beyond? The rural and older progressives reluctantly chose to re-enter the Republican Party, as Bob did, while other younger and more urban progressives chose to be Democrats, but did so with the same sort of reservations. The pool of participants in this political mix, was greatly enhanced by the return of World War II veterans, and I was one of those returning veterans. Now, my report on this period will be rather anecdotal. I understand the professor will give us the academic side of it, but in my case, it all started out when I was living with my parents in a little village on the Mississippi River called Ferryville, population 190, and it has held pretty steady at 190 ever since. My father had a business there, and I was working with him in the business. The only newspaper I read on a regular basis was the La Crosse Tribune, and the La Crosse Tribune really covered very little of what was going on in the state's capital. In fact, the only report I had on state politics was John Wingard. And I must say that John didn't give me very much on the liberal line. I did get the impression that there was some sort of a fight going on between somebody by the name of State Senator Bob Tian and another Milwaukee Democrat named Charlie Green. But from Wingard's column, I could never tell which of them was the good guy. One day I recall that while I was at the university here before the war, Mr. Evu had a very cheap price on the Monday edition of the Capital Times, so I quickly subscribed to it and began to realize that I was not the only returning veteran who had ideas about taking over and revitalizing the Democratic Party. It was not, however, until I attended a convention of sorts at Central High here in Madison in June of 1948 that I realized that I was really in pretty good company. I don't think I met Tom Fairchild on that occasion, but I did meet Henry Royce, Carl Thompson, Jim Doyle, Horace Wilkie, Gaylord Nelson, and many others. I was so excited that I went back to Ferryville, and I really redoubled my efforts in trying to get enough nomination papers signed so I could run for the assembly. And it didn't seem to be bothering me much that my opponent in that campaign, if I got the nomination, would be Don McDowell, who was then the Speaker of the Assembly. Matter of fact, my mother was out campaigning for me, and a woman said, "Gee, Mrs. Lucy, I'd like to vote for your son, but I can't. You know, Mr. McDowell is Speaker of the House." My mother didn't know what Speaker of the House was, but she said, if Mr. McDowell could get to be Speaker of the House by being elected to the Assembly in Crawford County, I'm sure that my son could make it too, because one thing I know for certain, we never can make him shut up around home. For some months before I started to run for the Assembly, I was busy organizing the Democratic Party of Crawford County. And when I announced my candidacy, Marguerite Rogers, who was our Register of Deeds and the only Democrat in the Crawford County Courthouse, called me aside and she says, "Now that you are the candidate, the most important thing that you can do for the party is to get elected." And I followed her advice most of the time, but there was one exception. There was a big rally planned at the city park in Prairie du Chien, which is the largest city in the district, and Bill Carroll was the old guard Democratic political boss in Crawford County, and he was running for governor that year against my new friend, Carl Thompson. Bill Carroll had run for office every 2 years for as long as I could remember. He only won once, and that was for state senator in the the Roosevelt landslide in 1932. And during those 4 years that he was here in Madison, he teamed up with the conservative Republicans in the legislature to make life miserable for Phil LaFollette. I refused to attend the rally unless Carl Thompson received equal time. Marguerite was upset. She was sure I was blowing my chances of getting elected. Finally, a compromise was reached. Carl Thompson would not be invited, but our candidate for Attorney General would be invited. And so Tom Fairchild, a young lawyer from Foley and Lardner, then called Miller, Mack, and Fairchild, and Tom will be quick to tell you that that Fairchild name was not his, would come out from Milwaukee and share the platform with Mr. Carroll. I suspect that that's probably as far from Milwaukee as Tom got in that campaign, and I doubt that his speech in Prairie du Chien had much to do with his election. But his appearance did solve a major problem for me in my efforts to win the assembly seat from the Speaker of the Assembly. In the 1949 Assembly, Democrats were outnumbered by Republicans 74 to 26. We were not a powerhouse, but it was better than it had been in the 1947 session when we only had 12 Democrats. In addition to our own vote, we could also count on help from certain Republican legislators who were then Republicans, but had been progressives as long as they had a party. And having Tom Fairchild sitting in the Attorney General's chair added a certain dignity to our efforts. Tom was, after all, the first Democrat to be elected to statewide office since the 1930s. The new breed of Democratic legislators were expected to do more than legislate. Statutory party organizations existed in most counties, but they did little but control federal patronage. They showed little, if any, interest in recruiting candidates or winning local elections. There was a lot of party building to do. Night after night and on weekends, people like Bill Duffy of Green Bay, Tommy Taylor of Racine, and many others visited rural counties seeking out people who were interested in building a new kind of political party. Gradually, a formula was developed. We would persuade a local cadre to set up a meeting with the understanding that two of us from outside the county would be present, one as organizer and the other as speaker. The formula applied to urban counties as well as rural. The case of Racine County is quite interesting. I was designated as the organizer. Tom Fairchild was asked to be the speaker. On the appointed evening, Tom and I arrived in Racine and went to the place where the meeting was to be held and discovered a huge crowd. The two factions were well defined. There was Jerry Flynn, who represented sort of the traditional Democrats, and Sam Rizzo, a UAW organizer, who represented the labor wing of the party. The crowd, as I say, was very large, and as I called the meeting to order and introduced Tom Fairchild, he got up and gave an inspiring speech. But at that point, the plan broke down. Sam Rizzo was impressed by the turnout, but wasn't sure he had a majority. So he suggested the actual voting should occur on another occasion, and he would be sure that an even larger crowd would be assembled. I expected an opposite reaction from Jerry Flynn. I thought surely he would want to vote. But actually, Jerry couldn't size up that crowd any better than Sam could, and so he agreed that the election should be put off. And so Tom and I drove back to Madison without accomplishing our mission. Subsequently, a larger meeting was held. Officers were elected. I think Sam's side won. But in less than 10 years, Jerry Flynn, the loser, was elected to Congress by these same people. And so the story had a happy ending. The organizational drive continued with great vigor through 1949, culminating in a historic convention in Green Bay in the late fall. The effort was by no means complete. Quite a few smaller counties remained unorganized. In 1950, of course, was another election year, and Attorney General Tom Fairchild was the party's favorite for U.S. Senator. But we had a strict rule against endorsement, something we inherited from the progressives. He had to enter a four-way primary in order to win the nomination. But Tom won the primary, and I was the candidate for Congress in the 3rd District. By today's standard, I had an odd way of setting up a campaign organization. My job was to recruit candidates for all of the legislative posts in my 10-county district. Next, I set about to find 10 young lawyers to run for district attorney, 10 people with some interest in law enforcement to run for sheriff, and as many candidates as I could find for every other partisan local office, right down to surveyor. My theory was that coattails work both ways, from the top down and from the bottom up. My Republican opponent was Gardner Withrow, a former railroad conductor who had served as a congressman in that district in the 30s, but as a progressive. But in 1946, he was running on the Republican ticket. The Republicans had a bit of a landslide in 46, as you remember, and Withrow was elected and immediately tried to live down his progressive and brotherhood background. He even voted for Taft-Hartley, an anti-labor product of the Republican 80th Congress. But even that wasn't good enough for the conservative Republicans here in Wisconsin in the mid-century. They were determined to eliminate him in the September primary, and their efforts were thwarted only because 2 conservative candidates instead of 1 decided to run. And so Labor forgave their old friend for his recent sins and endorsed Withrow. In a 3-way race, Withrow won narrowly, and my hopes for having a conservative opponent were dashed. Walter Reuther, national president of the auto workers, was scheduled to speak at the La Crosse Labor Hall on behalf of all of Labor's endorsed candidates. Tom Fairchild was campaigning with me in the 3rd District that day. He, of course, would wind up his campaign at the Labor Hall, where he would receive the warm endorsement of Walter Reuther. I had no intention of going there because Labor had endorsed Withrow, and I hadn't been invited, as a matter of fact. Tom was a better politician than I. He insisted I join him at the big event. I reluctantly agreed. We sat front and center in the hall where Mr. Reuther would surely see us. Reuther gave one of his stem-winding speeches, and at the end he endorsed Labor's chosen candidates, beginning with Carl Thompson for governor. When he got down to the 3rd Congressional District, he was significantly silent. I didn't get elected that year, but thanks to the political wisdom of Tom Fairchild, I won a small victory that night in that Labor Hall. What was I to do after the 1950 election? I could return home and help my father in his several small business enterprises, or devote all of my time to politics. We had come a long way toward the creation of a new political party, but we had much work to do before we could claim Wisconsin as a true 2-party state. By this time, Jim Doyle was the party chairman. He suggested that I come to work full-time for the party and reminded me of the challenge and opportunity Wisconsin Democrats would face with Joe McCarthy coming up for re-election in 1952. That did it. I was on board. I viewed McCarthy as a potential American Hitler. In making that judgment, I think I overestimated McCarthy's skills, but clearly he was an evil man and a most appropriate target for a new idealistic party. I hit the road as party organizer, building memberships, recruiting candidates, organizing rallies. The budget, of course, was very slim. I stayed at the homes of members whenever possible. We maintained a very modest second-floor headquarters on the Capitol Square. We published and mailed a monthly newspaper to the newspayers and prepared for the future. But the future we had in mind was close at hand. Our efforts were mainly directed at the 1952 Senate race. Henry Royce announced his bid for the nomination quite early. In fact, he devoted the better part of a year canvassing the state. But as the filing deadline approached, several party leaders urged Tom Fairchild to resign his post as U.S. Attorney for the Western District and enter the race. Nobody really disliked Henry, but the argument went that his campaign did not appear to be getting off the ground, and the race was so important that Tom, the only Democrat who had won statewide in recent history, had to be the candidate. Tom finally agreed. Enough signatures were obtained before the deadline, and the race was on. In September, Tom was our nominee. As executive director of the party, I had stayed neutral in the primary, but once the results were in, the Fairchild Committee asked that I become Tom's campaign manager. That was something I felt I had to clear with the party chairman, Jim Doyle. I called Jim, and he reminded me of why I had taken the job in the first place. He thought my move over to the Fairchild campaign was a logical progression. On the advice of Esther but he also said, before I left the job, that I had to find a replacement for myself at party headquarters. And so on the advice of Esther Kaplan, I called a graduate student by the name of John Gronowski, who had been very helpful to Horace Wilkie in a race for Congress the year before. And I called this graduate student, and whom I had never met, and I hired him over the phone. And I was ready to help Tom Fairchild become a U.S. Senator. One of our first problems, however, was that he had received an invitation from the White House for Tom to come to Washington immediately and have a laying of hands by President Truman. Now, under most circumstances, that would be a very welcome development. But under the situation we had at that time, it caused some pause, because poor old Harry's rating in the polls was about 23%. Chairman Doyle did not want the post-primary Fairchild campaign to start out with a White House visit. Of course, the candidate could not reject the invitation, but perhaps there could first be a meeting with the party's presidential candidate, Adlai Stevenson. The very next morning, the Lucys, Jean, Pat, and our infant son, Paul, who will be 50 in June, that gives you some perspective of the time element here, drove over to the Doyle's house to drop off Paul. Ruth Doyle had volunteered to babysit. Then we headed for Verona to pick up the candidate, and we were off to Springfield, Illinois, to meet the presidential candidate. Things went well until we were almost there. Suddenly, Jean, who was driving, indicated that the gas gauge was very low. Tom was determined that we be on time for the appointment. He and I agreed to continue without stopping for gas. A few miles from Springfield, Jean announced that the tank was empty. Tom and I got out and pushed the car for a few hundred feet to the nearest filling station, and luckily it was slightly downhill. When we arrived at Governor Stevenson's office on time, we were greeted by a bright young lawyer from Milwaukee who was Stevenson's aide-de-camp. You won't believe who it was. It was Newt Minow, who later distinguished himself in many roles, not the least of which was the chairmanship of the FCC during the Kennedy administration, when he described TV as a vast wasteland. After a very pleasant visit with Governor Stevenson, Jean and I drove Tom to the airport, where he boarded a DC-3 for the nation's capital and his appointment with President Truman the following morning. Jean and I then drove back to Madison, picked up our son Paul at the Doyles, and returned to our apartment. Now, I don't want you to think that that was a typical campaign day, but it was my first day as the campaign manager for the Fairchild campaign. With our primary in September, the campaign was necessarily abbreviated. One of our problems was that Lynn Schmidt of Merrill had conducted a well-publicized primary campaign against McCarthy. Unfortunately, it was so well-publicized and financed that many concerned citizens around the country felt that when Schmidt lost, that ended the effort to get rid of McCarthy. And many of them, of course, were not aware of the new Democratic Party in Wisconsin. As a result, our fundraising was so difficult that in this race of the century, we raised only about $40,000. My son David spent more than that getting himself elected to the school board in Milwaukee a couple of years ago. Tom was not a difficult candidate to manage. Punctuality is his middle name. A case in point, he was campaigning in northern Wisconsin. I desperately needed to reach him. At 2 minutes to 12 noon, I called the front desk of a hotel in a small city. I told the young lady that I wished to speak to Tom Fairchild. She said she didn't know anybody by that name and didn't see anybody around the lobby that looked like a stranger. I told her if she would stay on the phone for 1 minute, a car would make a right turn in front of her hotel, and on the car would be a huge triangular sign that would say, "Fairchild for U.S. Senator." And before I could get the words out of my mouth, she said, "Oh yes, here he comes now." As Election Day approached, a fellow by the name of Morgan, maybe Tom can supply his full name, at any rate, He had been J. Edgar Hoover's top advisor on communism. He resigned from the FBI, and he began to make speeches around the country to the effect that McCarthy's tactics were a hindrance to people who were really seriously working against communism. Maury Rubin of the Progressive magazine tracked him down to see if he would come into Wisconsin to speak for Fairchild. He readily agreed. We were all very excited about this development, but how do you maximize the effect of one speech so late in a campaign? Someone suggested television. I thought they were kidding. WTMJ was our only station in Wisconsin, and they were just getting off the ground. I asked how many TV sets there were in Milwaukee. Somebody told me that there were as many TV sets in the WTMJ market at that time as there had been in the whole country in 1948. Well, that sounded good enough for me. I called the station, and for $500, I was able to buy a half hour on a Sunday night at 8 o'clock. Now, most of the half hour was devoted to Morgan's speech, but we also managed to get the candidate on with Eleanor and the children. The next morning, I knew we had hit pay dirt when J. Edgar Hoover put out a statement repudiating Morgan, and Senator McCarthy issued a press release defending himself. It was the first time he had acknowledged that he had an opponent. We used what money we had to pay for time to run the audio tape of the program on as many radio stations as we possibly could, but it came too late to turn the tide. Tom ran well ahead of every other candidate, statewide candidate, but McCarthy's disservice to the country was extended for 6 more years. At least that's what everybody thought, until one day in 1957, when McCarthy went to his eternal reward. I heard the news on the car radio driving home from the office, and when I got home, Gene, who had already heard the report, insisted that I call Bill Proxmire at once. I agreed and did so. Some wag at the time suggested that I reach Proxmire before the Undertaker got to Joe. Proxmire had run for governor 3 times. Of course he should be the candidate, but not everybody agreed. There were even those who were shouting, anybody but Proxmire. I met with Proxmire the next day, agreed to be chairman of his committee, and contributed $500 to the campaign. Did I think he would win? No. What effect would his loss have on the new Democratic Party of Wisconsin? It would be devastating. Fran Rose, who was then the executive secretary of the party, talked seriously to me about what kind of work she might do after the campaign was over. She was sure that we would have to close down the headquarters. Not since Tom Fairchild's win for Attorney General in '48 had we won a single statewide office. The special election to replace Joe McCarthy was a do-or-die proposition for the party. Near the end of the campaign, it occurred to me that as the chairman of the campaign, I had done relatively little. I had learned long ago that when Bill Proxmire is the candidate, Bill Proxmire also runs the campaign. And over the years, there's only been one exception to that, and that was later on when Ellen, as his wife, did get involved in the management. But in 1957, Ellen was a new bride. The day before the election, I felt as chairman that I had a painful assignment, but I must carry it out. I called Ellen, and I said something to the effect that, you know, tomorrow's the election, and I don't see why this election is going to turn out any differently than all the other elections we've been through, and the only difference is that this time you're the wife of the candidate, and I just felt I should caution you to be prepared for all the bad news that's going to be coming in election night. Ellen shouted into the phone, "But Pat, you don't understand. We're going to win." My thought was that I had failed my obligation to her. I should have called earlier before she got this mindset of this emotional head of steam. The Proxmire victory in 1957 made all the difference. The following year, Prox was reelected to a full 6-year term, and nearly the whole state ticket was elected with him, including Gaylord Nelson and John Reynolds and Philly O'Nash. Many exciting things have happened to the party and to my career after that special election in 1957. But you've asked me to talk about the revitalization of the Democratic Party in the mid-20th century, and I think that goal was achieved with the special election of 1957. Fran Rose did not have to go out looking for another job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. That was splendid. The next person I'd like to introduce is a wonderful person who is one of the founding members of the Democratic Party. You know, everybody here in Dane County takes a lot for granted. In other words, that there is a Democratic Party and that you don't have anything to worry about. But if it weren't for the people at this table, there wouldn't be a Democratic Party. The next person, Mrs. Ellen Proxmire, is the author of 2 books, managed her husband's campaign, Senator Bill Proxmire, in 57, 58, and 64. And worked in the office of the Democratic Organizing Committee. And she was of the founding generation of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to recognize Mrs. Ellen Proxmire.
Thank you so much for asking all of us to speak on a subject that I hope is and will continue to be dear to your hearts, politics. A very quick reprise. Pat has alluded to part of Bill's early career. He moved to Wisconsin in 1949, and ran for the state legislature immediately and won the first time he ran. Then he ran for governor in 52 and 54 and 56 and lost all 3 times. I particularly remembered 1952 because we had put out a book, The McCarthy Record. Hundreds of us had worked and worked and worked. I'd worked the polls that day. I thought Adlai Stevenson should be president, Tom Fairchild should be senator, Bill Proxmire should be governor, and they all lost. Bill by 500,000 votes. And I remember crying and crying and crying and saying, I will never be active in politics again. It's just too hard. A wonderful commentator of my generation, Elmer Davis, he once wrote an article entitled The Grandeurs and Miseries of Old Age, and the phrase has stuck with me. One of the grandeurs of old age is the ability to reflect, to remember, and hopefully to relate one's experiences to today's world. There's a new Jackie Kennedy exhibit in Washington at an art gallery. I attended last week, and part of the exhibit was a huge seating chart for a dinner that took place in May 1962. Bill and I were there, and it struck me that that was 40 years ago. We were contemporaries of the Kennedys and saw them off and on when he was in the Senate and after he became president. But the 40 intervening years have seen just enormous change, unbelievable change in the world of politics. And the vignettes that I will explore briefly may seem as though they're from the dark ages. But there's a lesson in all of these experiences, a lesson for these times. The core factor is we had no money. None of us as individuals had money, the parties had no money, and politics was largely a volunteer effort in those years. We had no paid staff in 1952, 54, 56, when Bill ran for governor, and no paid staff when he ran for the Senate in 1957. Volunteers did all the work. They did the driving, the mailings, the advance work, and meeting preparation. In fact, some of you who are my age might remember Jerry Bruno. He really invented the art of advancing. No one had thought to prepare the way for a candidate when they went to town. In fact, Jerry Bruno was a factory worker from Kenosha, and he created the art of advancing. He went on to advance for President Kennedy as a candidate, and he was with him when he was assassinated. The second difficulty was the task of getting Bill's message across, because if he was going into a town, the papers would never even report that he was coming. So we would often have to purchase a little ad to announce that he was going to be at the Elks Hall, at a certain time. And in addition, to publicize the campaign, we fashioned out of wood, big heavy wood pieces, triangular monstrosities called car top signs. And they were secured to the top of a car by big suction cups. But once someone agreed to be a moving billboard for your candidacy, then you knew they were committed. And again, very little money was involved. It was all done by volunteers. Radio was and is always anxious to fill the many hours in the day. So whenever Bill was in town, a radio interview or a call-in show was arranged. Again, no money involved. Bill wrote all his own press releases, and he constantly peppered the newspapers with his opinions. In fact, when I went to the Historical Society last fall, one of the most interesting pictures of him is sitting in the back of a car where we'd fashioned a kind of a desk. And he'd sit in the back of the car typing and working while someone else drove him to the next meeting. And shaking hands. It became a ritual for Bill to go to games and festivals and plant gates and parades. He sometimes shook 10,000 hands in a weekend. Again, no money was involved. So perhaps all this sounds like the Dark Ages, but remember, these were times without television, no cell phones, no computers, just candidates with a cause, candidates with lots of stamina and determination. And we invented things. At the party headquarters, it sounds ridiculous in retrospect, but we invented what was called the Pledge Plan, where thousands of individuals in Wisconsin could pledge $1 a month to the party to support its activities. But now the process seems so slick, so contrived, so packaged, it's almost obscene to think that anyone would spend $50 million to win a seat in the U.S. Senate. But that's what's happening today, and no one raises a peep. And like the mess in the Middle East, it's a vicious circle. No party wants to give up the right to raise money until the other party does. So money, money, money continues to dominate the political scene. There's no question that money has influence and that it's affected our whole political process. As we get older and look back, I think there is truly time to assess one's life, one's accomplishments, and one's purpose. The 50s and the 60s were wonderful times for Bill, for Pat Lucy, for Gaylord, for Dave Carley, for Jim Doyle, for Tom Fairchild, and for many, many others. We had a cause, but we also had a good time. We worked hard and found a real sense of accomplishment once victory was ours. And we met and enjoyed many, many wonderful people along the way. The one real hope, I think, for individual life is to have an interesting life. And if politics is a chosen career, your life will always be interesting. New issues, new problems, new solutions, and the art of give and take. To be sure, there are complications and always too much to do, but your intellect is ceaselessly challenged, and there's always something new to learn. Maybe we look too nostalgically to the past, the good old days, but lessons can be learned from how we did it. And all the young men in that original small group that Pat has referred to, they went with their dreams and determination, and they all had distinguished careers and political successes. I think no state can match our accomplishment.
Thank you very much, Ellen. That was wonderful. The next person I'd like to introduce is a distinguished former senator and governor of Wisconsin, and we all now are represented by two great senators. Russ Feingold and Herb Kohl, but many of us also remember another pair of great senators who represented us for many decades, and that was Bill Proxmire and Gaylord Nelson. It's my great pleasure to introduce the Senator Nelson, Governor Nelson, founder of Earth Day, but unbeknownst to many of you, also one of the founders of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin, along with the other people at this table. Senator?
Matthew didn't give me time to finish my speaking notes. I prepare for speeches like I prepared the cases in law school. And, I remember my first day in law school in the old building in that amphitheater there. Is that the way you spell it? Anyway, William Herbert Page was a little fellow, about 5'3", and he would stand up before the class and ask a question and pat his forehead like this. The first day in law school, I went to the law school. On the bulletin board was a list of cases. The first line was by Page on contracts. So I did that, and then he assigned a number of cases. Well, the first case was a very, very complicated fact situation. And he called on two people before he called on me, and neither of those two had the facts straight. I was so nervous I spent an hour and a half on a one-page case getting the facts straight. So he finally was disgusted with the previous two people, and he looked on his chart, and he said, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Nelson. He repeated everything. I said, here. He said, I know you're here. I know you're here, but after you recite, I'll probably wish you weren't. Now, well, that was my, and he said, proceed. So I got the facts straight, and he was nodding and patting his forehead. He said, what is the law? What is the law? Well, he had put this case in his casebook to demonstrate what the law was not. It was bad law. And, of course, we'd been in his lecture hall for 5 minutes, and we should recognize that the Supreme Court of New York didn't know what they were talking about. So he said, proceed, proceed. And then he said, what is the law? I said, I recited the rule of law stated by the Supreme Court of New York, which is not the Supreme Court. It's I forget what it is. But any event, he said, Mr. Nelson, pick up your books, go out that door, go down out the front door, turn to the right, go in that building. That's the music school. He said, you may become a piccolo player, but you will never be a lawyer. And so Well, that was my introduction. Well, he had it pretty nearly right. Sort of like old Alban Barkley. I heard him one time say he was running for chairman or president of the Young Men's Business Club in Paducah. And he was, and the other candidate's manager got up and said, do we have to always have a lawyer hold every position in Paducah? The head of the school board is a lawyer, the mayor of the town is a lawyer, and so forth and so on. And Alban said, I thought I was destroyed. But I didn't count on, I underestimated my manager. He got up and destroyed the other guy's argument by saying that Mr. Barkley is a lawyer, but he's not much of a lawyer. And so so he said I won that election. Just shortly before I came here, I flipped open a wonderful book that identifies what happened in every year from 1900. And so I took 1945 and 46. I was on Okinawa when the atomic bomb was dropped, and the war came to an end after the second bomb was dropped in 1945. So I looked in the book, and this chronicle of events, and the top movie then in 45 was National Velvet with Mickey Rooney and Elizabeth Taylor. The John Steinbeck's Cannery Row won some award. Animal Farm was written or published by George Orwell. Arthur Schlesinger got the Pulitzer Prize for The Age of Jackson. And the top, in 1946, the top box office stars were Bing Crosby, Ingrid Bergman, Gary Cooper, Bob Hope, Humphrey Bogart, and Roy Rogers. That's the year that 12 Nazis were sentenced to death at Nuremberg. And then that's the year that a large number of TV sets were available to be sold. Now, I was on Okinawa at the time of the Portage Convention. And where were you? Were you in?
I was at the convention.
Yeah. I'm pretty good at guessing where you are all the time, but I was still on Okinawa at a replacement Repple depot, and then I got back. I read the Pony edition of Time magazine about the Portage Convention. My dad, who was a country doctor in Clear Lake, which is a big city compared to Pat's. We had about 650 more people in town than you had. But anyway, I read about the convention and the giving up of the Progressive Party. And my dad was chairman of the Polk County delegation, and the party at a conference in Balsam Lake instructed the delegates to keep the Progressive Party. And if they were going to give it up, go to the Democratic Party. However, do whatever Bob La Follette wants. And Bob had been raised as a liberal, progressive Republican, and the Democrats had not amounted to much in the state historically. So he got beat in the primary by Joe McCarthy. Then in 1948, Tom was elected Attorney General. Pat was elected to the Assembly. And the State Senate was blessed by my presence there. And that's where I met Mel Laird. And we've been good friends ever since, although he's wrong on every issue that I can think of. But anyway, we swept Dane County, all except the clerk of court. Horace Wilkie ran on the Democratic ticket for Congress. His brother was the DA, had been elected 2 years earlier when the progressives went to the Republican Party. This confuses a lot of people. Mel Laird, bless his soul, every time we appear on a platform, he points out that Nelson was once a Republican. Well, no Republican would admit that. But the progressive Republicans were the liberals was the Liberal Party in the state, although Bob Tian and a number of Democrats who stuck with the Democratic Party were good liberals and became good friends. But my dad, like many of the progressive Republicans, supported Wilson, supported Franklin Roosevelt. On the national scene, they always supported the Democrat. Now, you should have given me a couple of minutes more for the notes. I'm sure you think that's enough, and
Before you sit down, you got to tell one Clear Lake joke.
he said I got to tell one Clear Lake joke. I think those jokes that I tell about Clear Lake are too sophisticated for the audience. I was elected and with Pat and Tom, and then got to be governor and senator. Then one time, Tom's name came down from the president to the Jim Eastland's Judiciary Committee. And at the same time, a name of a federal judge from Illinois came to the Judiciary Committee. Now, Jim Eastland had a well-earned reputation as a racist, and I think he enjoyed the reputation, but he changed over the years, and I considered him a good friend, and thought that any chairman of any committee would come in, would have a useful function to serve my purpose if I kept him as a friend. So I went to Jim Eastland. Now, this was the appointment to the 7th Circuit. And these two, Tom and the other gentleman, what was his name?
Walter Cummings.
Walter Cummings. A name like that, he shouldn't be. But in any event, the first one to be confirmed would ultimately become the senior judge of the 7th Circuit Court, because they were all younger and these old duffers were passing out of the scene fairly quickly. So I went to Jim and said, could he think of a way to be sure that Tom, federal judge Tom Fairchild, was voted on first, because then he'd have seniority. Well, old Jim had looked at every situation and had a solution. His solution was to send down send Tom's name to the Senate a day ahead of Cummings' name, and then I suppose he did some maneuvering, and to make certain that the vote came on Tom's confirmation before Cummings' confirmation, which is what happened. And so even the bad guys have some good in them, don't they? So we got a judge out of old Jim Eastland, and he's gone to whatever reward he got, but I think he'd be pleased with your judge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. That was great. Actually, I have it on reliable information from one of the panel here who remain unmentioned that at some kind of a party out in California when the senator was the senator, he was in a room at a party with Bob Hope, believe it or not, and the two of them went back and forth, and many people there thought that the senator won. And I just want you to know that. That's a true story. The next, it's customary to have an academic here. In other words, besides having Achilles, we have Homer as well, somebody to write about it. And we're very pleased to have Alexander Shashko, who's a writer and a political scientist and doctoral student at the University of Michigan. He will also be writing the article that's supposed to come out of these lectures to legitimize them so that the dean and everybody at the law school will be pleased with us. And Alexander Shashko, the topic of his dissertation is the Young Turks, Wisconsin liberals in post-war America. And it's a significant and an important subject because I just repeat, everybody in this room who takes the Democratic Party of Dane County for granted with all its foibles, the fact of the matter is it wouldn't exist at all if it hadn't been for the people up here at this table. So, Mr. Shashko.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the University of Wisconsin Law School, Judge Fairchild, Matt Flynn, and everyone here for offering me the daunting challenge of sharing the podium with my fellow panelists. And special thanks to Lynn Thompson for making the arrangements today. Finally, I want to thank all of you for coming, and I have a request. My research is not done, and as important as these fine individuals are here at the table, I know that there are a lot of other people in this room and people whom all of you know who were involved in the Democratic Party at this time. And your stories are important, and if any of you are interested in doing an oral history or if you have any materials about your time, please come up to me afterwards and talk to me because I would actually really love to speak with you about it. And also a quick apology. As the fourth speaker, I apologize for the redundancies that may come up in my lecture. I'm going to do my best to avoid them. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the revitalization of the Wisconsin Democratic Party at mid-century and why it's important historically. The late 1940s and the early 1950s were a remarkable moment in Wisconsin politics, even by the standards of this state's idiosyncratic history. In this period of tremendous change, a group of young liberal activists, influenced by and influencing the events going on around them, succeeded in reshaping Wisconsin's political landscape. Their efforts were unique in the political history of post-war America. By successfully rebuilding a major political party through grassroots organizing, they went against the grain of many trends in post-war politics, from the nationalization of the major parties to the rising influence of money and television at the local level. Not surprisingly, their commitment to democratic politics, that's the Democratic with a small d, what resulted was one of the most innovative political parties in the United States. I want to describe how these liberal activists took advantage of the opportunity before them. They used some of the oldest tools in politics to modernize the Democratic Party in Wisconsin and make liberalism a credible ideology in the state, culminating in that first Democratic Organizing Committee convention in 1949. Their efforts, the efforts of today's speakers and many others, built the Democratic Party into a political force in the state, and more importantly, built an instrument for implementing policies on issues ranging from taxes to transportation to the environment that would become models for liberals nationwide. In our age, it's pretty difficult to comprehend the fluidity of party politics in Wisconsin after World War II. Sure, Wisconsin continues to be a magnet for third parties and their candidates, and political activists across the spectrum from John Birchers to Earth Firsters consider Wisconsin a haven for their perspectives. But in 1946, the structure of Wisconsin politics bore little resemblance to conditions nationally. While Franklin Roosevelt was turning liberalism into the dominant language of American politics, the Wisconsin Democratic Party languished as the laughingstock of the state. Since 1900, the party was rarely competitive. In fact, from 1900 to 1930, the Democratic Party didn't win a single statewide election. They had little influence in state politics. They had no influence nationally. And except for pockets of Milwaukee that had been successfully energized for FDR by organized labor, the Democrats had no effective organizational structure in the state. They typically finished third or fourth in state and local elections behind the progressives and the socialists and the Republicans. And they served as little more than an administrative arm for national Democratic patronage. As people mentioned before, they really were a party of postal employees. The reason for Democratic futility was largely this lingering presence of the progressive and socialist movements in Wisconsin. As long as those movements persisted, liberals and the left would continue to be represented by them, and the Democratic Party was marginalized. But as the 1940s dawned, socialism in Milwaukee was in decline. More importantly, the progressives took several disastrous turns. The La Follette family had proven tenacious and adept at leading progressivism for over 50 years. But both the organization and the ideology of progressivism failed to adapt to the consequences of New Deal reforms or the needs of ordinary Wisconsinites during and after World War II, who were now turning increasingly towards Washington instead of Madison for help. and Wisconsin progressivism could not regain its credibility after maintaining its isolationist policies during World War II, which led many progressives to abandon the leadership of the La Follette family. When the La Follette coalition collapsed, millions of Wisconsin progressives and liberals were left without a party to call home. Furthermore, Wisconsin's Republican Party was experiencing a transformation of its own in the 1930s and 40s, culminating in the emergence of Joe McCarthy. When the La Follettes abandoned the Republican Party to form the Progressive Party in 1934, they took the progressive and liberal factions with them. And as a result, of course, the Republicans grew more conservative. When former progressives, liberals, and socialists considered a return to the Republicans after the collapse of the Progressive Party, most found it inhospitable, and this ideological evolution came to a head in the 1946 Republican primary when Joe McCarthy defeated La Follette and ended the La Follette dynasty in Wisconsin. And at the same time, of course, became an enemy who would be an enemy who would unite many of the Young Turks as they would move forward. Liberals were stunned by McCarthy's victory. Indeed, it seemed that all of Wisconsin politics was in chaos at the time. The once mighty engine of progressive reform, the Wisconsin Republican Party, had been transformed, first by the missteps of the La Follettes, and then by the maneuvers of conservatives, into a party favoring deregulation and business interests. For former progressives, the Republican Party was a lost cause. And yet all of these changes offered an opportunity. It seems obvious enough in retrospect. The Democratic Party needed a constituency. Former progressives needed a new ideology. Liberalism in Wisconsin needed a political party. But bringing the three together was far from inevitable. Events had produced the conditions to complete a political realignment in Wisconsin, but the success of that realignment remained uncertain. This is the point in the story of Wisconsin's Democratic Party when crucial but imprecise social and political forces take a back seat to individual action, where the efforts of a small but committed group of men and women seized the moment and made it their own. The closest this group came to having a name first surfaced in print in 1948, when John Wingard of the Green Bay Press-Gazette, one of the most notable political columnists of the time, and notorious in this room, I suspect, announced that, quote, "The groundwork has been laid for a meaningful Democratic Party revolution in the formation of a slate of Young Turks, as they like to call themselves." It was a fitting name, the Young Turks, because it reflected the group's youthful inexperience in politics and their stubborn ambition to succeed where previous generations had failed. I don't know how many of my fellow panelists approve of this name, but I am sure that I will find out soon, and I'm going to use it anyway for now. They met through organizations like the American Veterans Committee, which gave liberal GIs an opportunity to have an alternative to groups like the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion. And perhaps most importantly, they met right here at the University of Wisconsin. In Madison, they shared classes with professors like Wilbur Cohen, Edwin Whitty, Arthur Altmeyer, Alexander Mickeljohn, and Selig Perlman, and many others, all of whom were committed to the Wisconsin idea and to the necessity of public service. Friendships made in the classroom spilled out into the Young Progressives Club, the Daily Cardinal staff, the staff of the Memorial Union, and the Roosevelt for President campaigns. In these early years of their political maturation, the Young Turks grew to share an important belief at that time. Not merely that liberal ideas were the best ideas, but that the ways in which a liberal party ought to be organized was central to what it meant to be a liberal. To the Young Turks, only a party built upon the ideals of democratic participation could produce truly liberal democratic politics. In other words, means-shaped ends. What the Young Turks did was the rarest of things. At a time when politics was increasingly centralized at the national level and local politics was increasingly about special interests, they built a grassroots organization dedicated to promoting a major political party. Their means towards this end were, it turns out, painstaking, laborious, and capable of testing the patience of even the most committed organizer. Starting in 1947, the Young Turks met at a restaurant in Johnson's Creek, halfway between Madison and Milwaukee, about once a month to build a new Democratic Party organization to replace the existing structure. That organization was the Democratic Organizing Committee, or DOC. In broadest terms, their plan was to organize liberal veterans, labor and students with former progressives and socialists into an organization that would eventually overtake the existing party leadership. As Pat Lucy noted, activists would travel to each county to visit potential allies. They would try to find a few people to serve as county leaders, usually labor organizers, former progressives, postmasters, or leaders of farm cooperatives. Said Jim Doyle Sr., one of the most visible and important of the Young Turks, about those trips, quote, "It sounds so feeble, and it was, scratching around for one name, Often one of us would go out there and travel 200 to 250 miles one way to some of those places. We'd get there and we'd find that there were only two people there. The person we called and possibly his wife. I was going to say spouse, but it would always be the wife. To raise money, local leaders sold DOC T-shirts and held bake sales. By 1949, when the DOC was largely organized across the state, the entire statewide budget was still only $4,500. But in the early years, money was not the only or even the most important priority, said Ruth Doyle, Jim Doyle's wife, and herself an invaluable DOC activist. The best way to campaign doesn't cost a nickel. Try the neighborhood meeting or gatherings of people in small groups that want to talk to you about things. These organizing trips were hard work for all the DOC volunteers, wrote Carl Thompson, perhaps the most indefatigable traveler of the group. I was away from home for 28 out of 30 consecutive evenings this summer, a condition not conducive to domestic tranquility. Others have put in much more time than they should be expected to put in. Some of the women in the office have been putting in 30 to 40 hours a week without one penny's pay for it. As Ellen Proxmire noted, only a handful of organizers were financially independent, and most of them scrambled to make money when they were not organizing. Many held full-time jobs during the day and organized in evenings and on weekends. Thompson continued, "Frankly, I don't enjoy being away from home so much. This organizational job doesn't involve honor or power. It is just shoe leather and perspiration. But unless it's done, it is my opinion that the Democratic Party in Wisconsin will be in the same position as the Republican Party in the South, so far as electing people to office except in isolated instances." Although men provided the public face of the DOC, the women of the DOC ran the grassroots organization. The early years of the DOC provided a rare moment in Wisconsin political history when women played a prominent role in either party. The overwhelming number of DOC orators and candidates were male, a condition that was rarely disputed by either men or women at the time. But because the DOC was a new organization, women had more opportunities to participate in party politics at levels typically reserved for men. Women like Esther Kaplan, Ellen Proxmire, Virginia Hart, and Esther Lawton did much of the door-to-door work in Dane and Milwaukee counties, organized phone banks, and built the membership files for each county. They addressed stuffed and distributed literature, set up voter registration drives, and organized pools to take voters to the polls. As the DOC grew more powerful within the Democratic Party, women lost much of their authority, thus ending a moment of relative gender equity in Wisconsin Democratic Party politics that would not be matched until the present day. But in the 1940s, while men were responsible for stimulating liberal activism by traversing the state, it was the DOC women who kept that activism alive by building and maintaining the institutions of a grassroots organization. Progress for the DOC was slow at first. In the Fox River Valley, often no one, not even the county leader, would show up for meetings. That doesn't surprise too many people here, I suspect. The DOC knew that it faced particular animosity outside of Madison and Milwaukee, a challenge facing Democrats to this day. Upstate Democrats, former Milwaukee Mayor Dan Hoan wrote at the time, quote, "are suspicious, skeptical, even jealous. They resent dictation from that Madison crowd. And when they use the term Madison crowd, it is stated with a tenseness and emotion that is beyond reason." Milwaukee already had a solidly liberal Democratic Party structure, but the city still posed special problems. Like almost every other political movement in the state's history, the Young Turks had to address the gulf between the state's largest city and the rest of the state. The DOC encountered sympathy for the organization on the city's east side and North Shore suburbs, where liberals were often middle-class professionals and academics, and the black community was also being courted, although few in the DOC had ties to it. But the city's working-class south side had a Democratic organization for a generation, courtesy of the labor unions, and the area had already elected Democrat Clement Zablocki to the House of Representatives. As longtime Democrats comfortable with the cultural conservatism of the old regime in the state, Southsiders viewed the Young Turks warily, even Milwaukeeans like Henry Meyer. Meyer countered by emphasizing the new liberal vision of the DOC, quote, "because it was all we really had as a weapon." Slowly but surely, Milwaukee was reorganized, but the tensions between Milwaukee Democrats and the leadership in Madison, like the relationship between rural and urban constituencies, would remain and at times intensify in the decades ahead. Despite irregular success and the appearance of differences that would plague Democrats throughout the post-war era, organizing eventually succeeded, most easily in urban areas and then into rural areas in 1948 and 1949. Many Wisconsinites were clamoring for an heir to progressivism and joined the ranks of the Young Turks. By August 1949, the DOC had units in 34 counties. That number increased to 50 by the start of the first DOC convention in November. The following summer, 65 counties had organizations. And by October 1951, all 71 counties were connected in some way to the DOC. Their work was tedious, but as the Young Turks pressed forward, the long hours spent together had an unexpected but important benefit. They became friends. If anything has struck me during my research of the DOC and here today, it's that the organizers, despite difficult odds, had a lot of fun. They were passionate about their beliefs and their efforts, and they genuinely liked one another. And as some of you know, that is not always the case in politics. John Reynolds characterized the Young Turks as fine, honorable people, pretty decent, and attributed their success to the fact that we haven't really had many bad guys. After 3 years of organizing, the Young Turks had amassed a reservoir of trust with one another, a sense that collective goals had outweighed personal ambition. Said Jim Doyle, "It seemed to me fairly early in the game that we had this wonderful sort of peer democracy, an internal democracy. As the DOC grew and Young Turks started winning elections, sometimes against one another, this reservoir of trust was invaluable." After 3 years of patient organizing, the DOC had its first convention during the last weekend of November 1949 in Green Bay. By any measure, the Green Bay Convention was a triumph for the Young Turks. Blizzard conditions intensified a sense of missionary zeal and a spirit of confidence and determination that was already flourishing among the delegates. The DOC had achieved its first goal, to organize liberals across Wisconsin into a democratic activist political organization. "It was great, really great," said Doyle. "We could see the people there that we'd been searching out the preceding year, here, there, and everywhere, and damned if they didn't show up." Wisconsin Democrats were buoyed by the idea that their party was participatory and that the leadership was indebted to the local activists who had helped build the party. But before I conclude, a quick note. If I have made the rise of the DOC seem utopian, rest assured that it was not. Like any other political movement, the DOC leadership was ambitious, sometimes territorial, and yes, as they would discover in the decades ahead, they were divided on important issues. And yet, their shared belief in the power of democracy, in the tenets of liberalism, and in each other, gave them the courage to navigate the uncertain political waters of Wisconsin at the time. And it inspired many of the decisions they made when they finally gained political power in the late 1950s and early 1960s. As we look back at history from our own time, where money and political professionals have overshadowed political activism by ordinary people, the efforts of the Young Turks remind us that there are alternatives to the way we engage in politics. Although the circumstances of their ascent were unusual, their means were not. Then, as now, the essence of politics remains a commitment to building communities, to encouraging dialogue, and to finding creative solutions to complicated problems. The implications are still relevant today. The story of Wisconsin's Democratic Party is unique, but its moral is timeless. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. That was very fine. It now gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce the person for whom this lecture series is named. It must be kind of a daunting thing to have a lecture series named for you and sit here and listen to all this, and this is Judge Fairchild's chance to do his response. I'll only say this by way of anecdotal background and then invite him to the microphone, and that is this. I clerked for Tom Fairchild in 1975, 1976, the first year he was the chief judge of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago. And there are a number of his clerks here whom I see around the room. And it was his clerks who had the impetus to start this lecture series. And I think I can speak for all of us in saying that our clerkship with Tom Fairchild was the best jobs that any of us ever had in our lives. And one of them is a federal judge, Rena Raggi, in the Southern District or the Eastern District of New York, many professors, deans, and otherwise. But it was a wonderful job. And I want to remind you of something, that the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, as a result of Tom Fairchild's chief judgeship, has enjoyed the reputation ever since of being one of the strongest circuits in the country. But before he went on the Seventh Circuit in 1966, and this may be an apocryphal story, but it may be true, I don't know. But in any event, it is said that people on occasion would start their Supreme Court certiorari petitions by saying in the first sentence, this case originated in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and there are other reasons for reversal as well. Now, When Judge Fairchild went on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, that all changed. It's now one of the most respected ones. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Judge Tom Fairchild.
I want to start by saying my thank yous, which I should say here to everybody that came, and just a wonderful bunch of people. So many that I know and have known for years, and quite a few of the reference to the Dane County women workers that ran this thing back in 48 and 50, and so there's some of them here too. I want to express how grateful I am to Pat and to Ellen and Gaylord and Alexander for their contributions here today, and grateful to Matt and Niels for having put this thing together. You know, there was a time that Matt had a campaign for Congress, and I was in Chicago at the time, and I was visiting with him over the phone, and while we were talking about this campaign and how it was going, and he said, "Oh, Mary wants to talk to you," and I said, "Fine, great chance to talk to Mary," and so I said, "Mary, what do you think about this politics business that Matt is in?" And Mary said, "I think you bit him." I remember Gaylord from way back. I think we were young progressives together or something. But one of the big things I remember about him is his sitting in my office for hours and hours on end in 1952, pumping me up to get into the race against Joe McCarthy. And that's a memory I carry with me. And Pat, of course, helping in the running of that campaign, as he did, including the running out of gas. I thought, you know, time is marching on, and I'm aware of that. And I thought maybe I'd just say a couple of things that would indicate what this was like, kind of jumping into cold water back in 1948 to run as a Democratic candidate for Attorney General. I was asked by Jim Doyle to do that, and had to be agreed. I was working, and I needed the job and needed the support, the money that came from it. And this was not a firm that was known for its liberal output. And I knew that running for anything as a Democrat would not be too favored at Miller Mac. So I said, it's got to be understood. I can't take time off to run for Attorney General. I've got to do this evenings and weekends, if you can imagine that. And so, okay, that was that. Well, this was going to be just purely an exercise, Jim said. Everybody knew, he said, that Truman wasn't going to win. And nobody was expecting anybody on this state Democratic ticket to win. Just don't count on that. You don't have to worry about that. We just want to field some candidates that we can build on for the future, as a matter of having put out a good bunch of candidates in 1948. Well, there was a compliment to his saying that that's what they were trying to do. But the acid proof of the fact that we didn't think there was any possibility of winning the office is the fact that until the votes were counted and I knew I had one in November, that was the first time that we looked at the statute book to see what the salary was for Attorney General. And we had the rude awakening of finding out we'd taken about a 30% cut. Thought I'd tell you a little bit about what was going on. Carl Thompson has been talked about here, and the work he did, it was a terrific amount of actual physical work running around the state and doing all this organizing work. And then he was one of the first progressives who decided to run for something as a Democrat. And he almost got himself elected to Congress in a special election in 47. One of the first progressives who tipped over to run as a Democrat. Well, just along this line of campaigning evenings and weekends, Carl would come to Milwaukee, and we'd go do something on the weekend. He'd come Friday night and stay at our house. You know, there was no money for hotel bills or anything, and on a particular time that I remember, and I saw a lady as I was coming in here this afternoon who may have some reference to this, because her family was from Dodge County, and they were involved in this. But we decided we'd spend that Saturday in Dodge County, because there had been a reputation that there used to be Democrats in Dodge County. So we'd go to several towns, and we'd go into stores and whatnot, and we'd tell people what we were up to. And all too often, as we were leaving, the storekeeper or somebody else in charge would say, "Well, it is nice to have met you anyway." Jerry Fox of Chilton, back in 1938, there was a coalition of the Democrats, who were really the third party, and the Republicans to knock off Phil LaFollette. And the people had run for office to be nominated to try to get both nominations and so forth. Anyway, the man who won the Democratic nomination for governor in 38, true to what they had decided to withdraw in favor of the Republican nominee, who was Julius Heil. So the Democratic nominee for governor, withdrew after the primary. And Jerry Fox got the great and pleasant job of running for being the Democratic candidate for governor, being put in that position after the September primary so that he could run from then until November. And Jerry had a story that he loved to tell of going up to Eau Claire someplace and introducing himself to a man as the Democratic candidate for governor. The man said, "Did you say that you were the Democratic candidate for governor?" Jerry said, "Yes." And the man responded, "Of what state?" On my Saturday with Carl, we decided we weren't making much headway in Dodge County. And Carl had the bright idea, I think this was in Horicon, Carl had the bright idea of calling on a school friend, law school friend, who was the Republican county chairman of Dodge County, and asking him whom he would see in Horicon if he were looking for help as a Democrat. Well, the Republican chairman was a good friend, and he gave sound advice. He told us to go look up the president of the local union at, I guess, Van Brunt Manufacturing, which we did, and we got some help, at least introducing some people. We were using my car, and after there was one successive afternoon, a coffee group that the Cliffords had gotten together in Juneau or wherever, and that was about the only time we met more than one person who was willing to say they were a Democrat. We did go to another meeting, which had been, we understood, at the hotel in Beaver Dam, and one person showed up at that. After those two rather unsuccessful meetings, we were using my car, and during that evening, we drove back to Old Highway 30 on which the Badger bus operated between Madison and Milwaukee. We waited a few minutes on the shoulder, flagged down a bus, and the Democratic candidate for governor rode west on the bus while the Democratic candidate for attorney general drove home. I love the job of attorney general, which I was fortunate enough to get, and that really was a fluke because the Republican primary had misfired so badly. They had nominated people whose names were familiar, but they were for attorney general and for treasurer. They were not the people that they thought they were voting for. Those were people who had been incumbents, but one of them had died and one of them had been appointed to the Supreme Court in the meantime. And the newspapers made such fun of this outcome of the Republican primary that it looked as if maybe there was a little chance there. Maybe this thing was changing a little. And the first thing I did, I went and I got the help of a great friend who gave me an awful lot of help in this whole effort. I went down on that Saturday to Janesville, and I went to see my old friend and classmate, Leon Feingold. And he and I worked out how we were going to work at this thing, and somehow or other it finally worked. And in case you noticed from the name, Leon Feingold was the father of the present Senator Russ Feingold of Wisconsin. Incidentally, I've often said that Russ is probably the only senator of whom, well, certainly the only senator of whom I will be able to say that when I first met him, he was in his crib. I loved the job of Attorney General, and I tried to be conscientious. I sometimes seemed to specialize, however, in writing unpopular opinions on subjects like a program to raise money to promote dairying, which we found was not legally sound, or release time for religious instruction, and that caused a big furor, and games that were found to be lotteries, and that raised a lot more furor. And at one point in the campaign in 1950, after this had all gone on, a group of basically friendly people said, "Tom is too damned honest for politics." We tried to turn that into a campaign slogan. But people didn't quite fall for it. There were, pressures aplenty on a successful candidate, the only successful Democratic candidate, statewide candidate for quite a few years. And those things are hard to deal with because there's pressures to do things that run for things that maybe you shouldn't have, and I should have stuck to the running again for Attorney General, but anyway, I ran for the Senate. And so then the difficulty and the responsibility of making a decision came up very strong in 1952 when Joe McCarthy was the incumbent senator. It was important to try to defeat him, and he presented a moral as well as a political issue, in my view. My family and I were totally dependent on my salary as U.S. Attorney, and although my record gave reason to believe I would be the stronger candidate, I could not enter the race early. So when I was finally put to it, Len Schmidt, a former progressive, had built a campaign to defeat McCarthy in the Republican primary. Henry Royce had built a campaign to defeat him as a Democrat in the general election. And the question for me was, does Tom Fairchild's late entry spoil chances for Schmidt or Royce to do what needed to be done? The responsibility was heavy, but I make no apology for the ultimate decision. I did not win, but more than 100,000 people who voted Republican for president and governor voted for me for senator. And a letter that I got toward the end of that campaign maybe says this all, and I can stop with that. He said you're going to win, which of course was nice of him to say, but it didn't work out. But in proving that proposition, he said, you will get thousands of votes for decency besides those you get in your own right.
Thank you very much, Judge. At this point, if anybody has any questions, we'd like to take them. And they've only asked that whoever asked them, somebody apparently is going to come forward and pass this microphone. The young fellow in the glasses is on his way down to take this and pass it around the crowd. Anybody? And if there's anybody in the other room that's watching this that would like to ask a question, just come on into this room, okay? Thank you. And just direct it to whoever you want at the table.
I wonder whether Governor Lucey and Senator Nelson could remember what they spent on their last political campaigns. Your last campaign for governor and your last campaign for senator.
I think I was elected governor in '70 for about $400,000, and I think maybe as an incumbent we may have raised and spent as much as $600,000.
Bill, nothing.
You paid a filing fee or something.
If I could remember it, it was so small that it would be embarrassing to tell you. I remember, however, my election for governor. I think the first time I ran for governor and won, I think it was 135,000 votes. It was something under 200,000. Now their assemblymen spend far more than we spent on for U.S. senator or governor. But
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to know if anybody in the front of this room knows a good Republican governor.
I couldn't understand the question. Could he repeat the question?
Maybe somebody can restate it.
Who was a good Republican governor?
Who was a good Republican governor? I can't think of it.
Walter Goodland.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there were any members of the university faculty who played a particularly significant role in inspiring any of you to your activities in public life, and any members of the academic community who were significant players in the revitalization of the party in the years you've been discussing.
Academic community?
Yeah. Who wants
Bill
to answer?
Rice. Bill Rice.
But did they want academic people who ran for office or academic people who helped?
Both. Or just were inspirations to you guys when you were younger.
Well, Ralph Hewitt was a friend of Bill's and ended up working on his staff. Neither of us went to the University of Wisconsin, so from that point of view, there were none. But Bill consulted with university people constantly.
Apropos of that earlier question about a good Republican governor.
Careful.
I'll be careful. Something that I have never seen really noticed, but it's a fact. A Republican governor, Walter Kohler Sr., had 5 vacancies on the Supreme Court of Wisconsin during his 2-year term. 5 vacancies to fill. And he appointed 2 known Democrats, a fairly progressive Republican and 2 conservative Republicans. And I always figured that was something that ought to be noticed sometime.
You're going to ignore Warren Knowles? I have a question that will test your memory as well as mine, particularly our friend from Michigan, and I'll forgive you for that. And that is, in the fall of '46, we had a school bus referendum. Does that play into your history? That really caught the attention of the whole state. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, a referendum as to whether kids in parochial schools ought to ride in public school buses, which was huge that fall. And did that play into Governor Lucey, play into the politics of that era? I thought it did.
I don't recall.
Senator Nelson, whatever?
I know it was a very emotional issue at the time, but I don't think it really related to the building of the new Democratic Party.
Well, it was several attempts to get Catholic votes and this was one. I was in Milwaukee, a state senator who I can't recall. I can see him, but I can't recall his name. They passed the bill, and he and I rode back in the same car from this meeting, and he was laughing. He said, "Now we've got you." I was governor at the time. He said, if you sign it, all the Protestants will be mad. If you veto it, all the Catholics will be mad. So I called a classmate who was a lawyer in Milwaukee and now is a lawyer in Israel. Pardon? Marv Klitzner. Yeah, Marv Klitzner. And he got the highest grades of anybody up until that time. And I don't know whether anybody surpassed him. Old Herbert Page said one time, I gave him 99 because nobody is perfect. So I got back to the office. I picked up the phone. I called Marvin Klitzner. And I said, here's the problem. Is that constitutional? If it is, I will sign it. No, if it's unconstitutional, I will sign it. Marvin called me back before the day was out, and he said it's clearly unconstitutional. So I signed it and requested under the statute expedited treatment by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. That was an honest way to handle it.
I think we have time for one more question. As you can see, the state was in very good hands between 1958 and 1962. If we have one more question. At this point, I would like to turn the podium over to the Dean of the Wisconsin Law School and to thank you again very much, Dean, for hosting us today.
Well, thank you again, Matt and Nils, for organizing this, and I think the discussion could go on forever. And maybe it can, because you're all invited to a reception out in the atrium, and I hope you'll be able to stay and talk some more with the panelists. But before we do that, I want to thank all of our panelists one more time. And I want to do one other thing that those of you who have joined us in the past for Fairchild Lectures know is a part of the ritual, and that is to thank our speakers by giving them a memento of the law school that I think has been connected to the law school almost as long as some of our panelists. Bear with me, I have been working out because I anticipated the burden that is about to face me here. These are the gargoyle, the symbol of the law school, and we have one for each of our panelists. So I will. This one is for Senator Gaylord Nelson.
Looks like one of my professors.
Governor Lucy. Thank you. Proxmire.
Thank you. Waste of time.
Yeah. Alexander Shasko. And finally, of course, Judge Fairchild. Thank you all, and again, hope to see you in the reception outside.